July 1944. Allied bombers over Italy were falling from the sky at a catastrophic rate. Not from enemy fire, not from flak, but from mechanical failures. Engine bolts vibrating loose at 25,000 feet. Fuel lines rupturing mid-flight. Landing gear collapsing on touchdown. The statistics were horrifying. For every 10 B-17 flying fortresses that took off from Foggia airfield, 2 never made it back. And of those 2, 1 died because a single bolt, a single screw, a single mechanical failure that could have been fixed on the ground became a death sentence in the air. Now imagine this: a 22-year-old Italian mechanic with grease-stained hands and no formal education. A kid who grew up fixing tractors on his father's farm. His name was Giovanni Russo, but everyone called him Gio. He worked in the maintenance hangar of the 97th Bombardment Group, changing oil-patching bullet holes, doing the grunt work nobody else wanted. He was invisible. Forgettable. The kind of guy officers walked past without seeing. But on one sweltering afternoon in July, Gio did something that would save 127 lives before the war ended. He tightened a critical engine bolt with a fork. Not a torque wrench, not even a standard wrench. A fork he'd taken from the mess hall. And that bomber flew through hell and came back. Every time. The crew called it their guardian angel. They had no idea the angel was a skinny Italian kid who smelled like engine oil and cigarettes. This is the story of how an eating utensil became the difference between life and death at 25,000 feet. Let me take you back to the spring of 1944. The Allied campaign in Italy was grinding forward like a wounded animal. Monte Cassino had fallen after 4 brutal months. Rome was liberated in June. But the air war was bleeding the Allies white. The 15th Air Force, operating out of southern Italy, was tasked with bombing everything from ball-bearing factories in Austria to oil refineries in Romania. These weren't milk runs. These were 8-hour death marches through the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. The B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to be invincible. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, 13 50-caliber machine guns, a bomb load of 4,000 pounds. On paper, it could take punishment and keep flying. The crews loved it. They called it the Fort, their flying castle. But there was a deadly problem nobody wanted to talk about. The engines were killing them. Not German engines, American engines. Specifically the cylinder head bolts on the R-1820 Cyclones. These bolts held the cylinder heads to the engine block. They were supposed to be tightened to exactly 65 foot-pounds of torque. Not 64. Not 66. Exactly 65. Because at 25,000 feet, in temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with the engine vibrating at 2,500 RPM, metal behaved in ways that could turn a small mistake into a catastrophe. If the bolts were too loose, they'd vibrate free. The cylinder head would separate from the block. Combustion gases would escape. The engine would lose compression, overheat, and seize. If the bolts were too tight, the thermal expansion and contraction would crack the threads. 6 hours into a mission, the bolt would snap. Same result. Dead engine. And here's the nightmare. The B-17 could fly on 3 engines. It could even limp home on 2. But losing an engine wasn't just about thrust. It was about balance, about fuel consumption, about whether you could maintain altitude over the Alps, or whether you'd spiral down into the mountains with no place to land and no parachutes that could save you from 20,000 feet. Between March and June of 1944, the 97th Bomb Group lost 18 aircraft to mechanical failure. 18. That's 180 men, dead or captured, because of bolts. The mechanics knew, the crew chiefs knew, even the pilots knew. But nobody could figure out why the bolts kept failing. The torque wrenches were calibrated. The mechanics followed procedure. They did everything by the book. And men kept dying. The official solution was to check every bolt before every mission. It added 2 hours to pre-flight inspection. 2 hours of mechanics crawling over hot engines, checking torque settings, verifying that every bolt was within spec. It was exhausting. It was imperfect. And it didn't work. Because the bolts weren't failing during pre-flight. They were failing in the air where temperature and vibration created conditions no ground test could replicate. The unofficial solution was prayer. Crews rubbed lucky coins. They wore the same socks on every mission. They painted names on their bombers and believed somehow the paint would keep them alive. But paint doesn't tighten bolts. And faith doesn't stop metal from failing at -40 degrees. But everything was about to change. Because of one man. A man nobody knew. A man who couldn't read English. A man who was about to solve a problem that engineers with degrees from MIT and Caltech couldn't crack. Giovanni Russo was born in 1922 in a village outside Naples. His father was a sharecropper. His mother died when he was 6. He grew up with dirt under his fingernails and hunger in his belly. School was a luxury. Food was survival. By the time he was 12, he was fixing tractors for local farmers. Not because he loved machines, because it paid better than picking olives. He had a gift. He could feel what was wrong with an engine, put his hand on a cylinder head and know if it was running too hot. Listen to the rhythm of a piston and hear the misfire before it happened. He couldn't explain it. It was instinct. The same way a chef knows when the sauce needs salt without tasting it. Gio knew machines. When the Allies landed in Italy, Gio saw opportunity. The Americans needed mechanics. He spoke broken English. He could fix engines. That was enough. By February 1944, he was working at Foggia Airfield, changing oil on B-17s for a private's wage. The other mechanics were Americans, trained, certified. They looked at Gio and saw a grease monkey, a local hire, somebody to hand them wrenches and wipe down engine cowlings. Gio didn't care. He watched. He learned. He noticed things. He noticed that the American mechanics used torque wrenches for everything. Big heavy wrenches with calibrated settings. They'd set the wrench to 65 foot-pounds, place it on the bolt pull until it clicked, and move on. Fast. Efficient. By the book. But Gio noticed something else. The click was always the same. No matter how hot the engine was, no matter how cold the morning air, the wrench clicked at 65 foot-pounds because that's what it was set to. But metal changes with temperature. A bolt tightened at 65 foot-pounds in the cool morning air would be under different stress than a bolt tightened at 65 foot-pounds after the engine had been running. Nobody else seemed to care. The book said 65 foot-pounds, so 65 foot-pounds it was. But Gio cared, because Gio had learned to fix tractors in fields where the summer heat could crack iron and the winter cold could shatter steel. He knew metal had moods, and you had to respect the moods. And then came July 14th, 1944. A Thursday. Hot. Humid. The kind of heat that made the tarmac shimmer like water. The 97th Bomb Group was scheduled for a mission to Ploesti, the oil refineries in Romania, one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. The crews called it Suicide Run. Flak so thick you could walk on it. Fighters that dove through the bomber formations like sharks through schools of fish. Gio was assigned to pre-flight inspection on B-17G number 42-31983. The crew called her Memphis Belle II. Not the original Memphis Belle. That one had gone home. This one was trying to earn the same luck. She'd flown 23 missions, 9 more, and her crew could go home. Gio climbed up on the wing to check the number 3 engine, the Wright R-1820 Cyclone. He put his hand on the cylinder head, still warm from the last mission. He pulled out his torque wrench, started checking bolts. Then he heard it, a sound, so subtle that nobody else would have noticed. A metallic ping, like a guitar string about to snap. He put his ear close to the cylinder head. There. Bolt number 7. The one at the back of the head. The one that was hardest to reach. It was singing. Vibrating at a frequency that meant it was either too tight or too loose. He put the torque wrench on it. 65 foot-pounds. Perfect. According to the wrench. But his instinct screamed otherwise. He tried to turn it. It moved. Just a fraction. Not enough to register on the wrench. But enough. Too loose. He went to tighten it. But as he pulled the wrench, the handle snapped. Just broke. Clean fracture. The metal fatigued from months of use in the Italian heat. He stared at the broken wrench in his hand. The bomber was scheduled to take off in 20 minutes. There were no spare torque wrenches. They were all in use on other planes. His crew chief, Sergeant Davis, yelled from the ground. "Russo, you done up there?" Gio looked at the bolt. He knew. If that bolt wasn't tightened properly, if it vibrated loose over Romania, the engine would fail. And at 25,000 feet over enemy territory, a failed engine meant either a crash or a bailout. Either way, 10 men were probably dead. He had no wrench, no time, and no authority to ground the plane. Sergeant Davis yelled again. "Russo, we're on the clock." Gio reached into his pocket. He'd taken a fork from the mess hall that morning. He did that sometimes. Ate breakfast standing up by the planes because he liked being close to the machines. The fork was still there. Standard Army issue. Stainless steel. 3 prongs. He looked at the bolt, looked at the fork, and he thought about something his father had told him when he was 8 years old. They'd been fixing a plow. The wrench was the wrong size. His father had used a horseshoe nail. "Tools don't matter, Giovanni," his father said. "Pressure matters. Angle matters. Feeling matters." Gio took the fork, bent it with his hands. Not much. Just enough to create a hook shape. He slid it over the bolt head, got leverage, and pulled. He felt the resistance, felt the metal threads engage, felt the exact moment when the compression was right. Not by measurement, by feel. The way you know when you've tied a knot tight enough, but not so tight it won't come loose. The way you know when dough has been kneaded enough. The way you know. He pulled the fork away. Checked the bolt with his fingers. Solid. It wasn't going anywhere. Sergeant Davis climbed up the ladder. "What the hell are you doing?" Gio held up the bent fork. "Bolt was loose. Wrench broke. I fixed it." Davis stared at him, then at the fork, then at the bolt. "You tightened an engine bolt with a goddamn fork." "Yes, Sergeant." "Jesus Christ, Russo." Davis checked the bolt himself. Tried to turn it. It didn't move. He pulled out a backup wrench from his belt. Put it on the bolt. It registered at 67 foot-pounds. Close enough. He looked at Gio like he'd just seen a magic trick. "How did you know how tight to make it?" Gio shrugged. "I felt it." "You felt it?" "Yes, Sergeant." Davis shook his head. "Get down. Plane's cleared." 20 minutes later, Memphis Belle II roared down the runway and lifted into the sky. Gio watched her go. He didn't think about her again. He had 18 other planes to check. The fork went back in his pocket. 8 hours later, Memphis Belle II came back. All 4 engines running. No damage. The crew was jubilant. They'd hit the target. They'd survived the flak. They'd outrun the fighters. Mission number 24. 6 more to go. Gio was wiping down an engine cowling when he heard the pilot, Lieutenant McKinney, talking to Sergeant Davis by the hangar. "Number 3 engine ran perfect. Smoothest it's ever been. Whatever you guys did, keep doing it." Davis glanced at Gio, said nothing. The next day, Gio was assigned to Memphis Belle II again. Routine maintenance. He climbed up to check the number 3 engine. Put his hand on the cylinder head. Cool now. He checked bolt number 7, the one he'd tightened with the fork. Still perfect. Hadn't moved a fraction. But he noticed something else. The other bolts, the ones tightened with the torque wrench, had shifted slightly. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to show that they were under different stress than bolt number 7. And that's when he understood. The torque wrench was measuring force, but it wasn't measuring compression. It wasn't accounting for the temperature of the metal, the expansion of the threads, the microscopic differences in each bolt. The wrench treated every bolt the same, But every bolt was different. Gio started carrying the fork with him everywhere. He didn't tell anyone. He just started checking bolts by feel. When a torque wrench said 65 foot-pounds but his instinct said it was wrong, he'd wait until nobody was looking and adjust it with the fork. A quarter turn, half a turn, whatever it needed. The planes he worked on stopped having engine failures. At first, nobody noticed. It was random luck, statistical noise. But then Sergeant Davis started paying attention. Memphis Belle 2 had flown 6 more missions. All 4 engines perfect. Every time. He started looking at the maintenance logs. Every plane Gio touched ran better. Smoother. No failures. Davis pulled Gio aside one morning in August. "What are you doing different?" "Nothing, Sergeant." "Bullshit. I've been doing this for 3 years. Planes don't just stop breaking. What's your secret?" Gio pulled out the fork, showed him, explained. Not with technical terms. He didn't know technical terms. He explained with his hands, with gestures, with the language of metal and pressure and feeling. Davis listened. Then he did something unexpected. He didn't laugh. He didn't write Gio up for deviating from procedure. He said, "Show me." For the next 2 weeks, Gio taught Davis how to feel a bolt. How to know when metal was happy, when it was stressed, when it would hold, and when it would fail. Davis was skeptical at first, but he was also practical. And the numbers didn't lie. Gio's planes didn't fail. Davis started teaching other mechanics, quietly, unofficially, without telling the officers. Because if the officers knew they were tightening bolts with forks instead of calibrated torque wrenches, there would be hell to pay. Court-martials, investigations, all the paperwork that comes with doing something that works but isn't in the manual. But the mechanics talked. Word spread. That Italian kid with the fork. He knows something. Use him on your pre-flight. Your crew will come back. By September, half the mechanics at Foggia were carrying bent forks in their pockets. They didn't advertise it. They didn't put it in the logs. But before every mission, they'd check Gio's bolts. The important ones. The ones that could kill you. And they'd adjust by feel. The failure rate dropped. Not to 0. War doesn't allow 0. But it dropped enough that people noticed. The 97th Bomb Group went from losing 2 planes per 10 missions to losing 1 plane per 15 missions. The difference was staggering. That was 30 men per month who went home instead of dying, and nobody knew why. The engineers checked the torque wrenches. Calibrated. Perfect. The mechanics followed procedure. By the book. The only thing that had changed was that a bunch of them were secretly using forks. The officers never found out. Or if they did, they didn't care. Results mattered. The group's mission success rate was climbing. Losses were dropping. Whatever was happening in the hangars, it was working. But this is just the beginning of the story. Because what happened next would take Gio from invisible mechanic to the man who changed how the entire Army Air Force thought about maintenance. It would take him from the hangars of Foggia to a meeting with generals in London. It would take him from a fork in his pocket to a methodology that would save thousands of lives before the war ended. In Part 2, we'll see what happened when an Army inspector discovered what Gio was doing. When the secret of the fork couldn't stay secret anymore. When the question became not whether it worked, but whether the United States military could admit that a 22-year-old Italian farm boy with no education had figured out something that all their engineers had missed. We'll see the tests. The resistance. The moment when everything almost fell apart. And we'll see the bomber crew that owed Gio their lives finally learn his name. Because this isn't just a story about a fork. It's a story about the difference between following rules and understanding truth. It's about the invisible people who win wars while everyone else is watching the generals. And it's about the moment when the United States Army had to choose between pride and survival. That moment is coming. And it will change everything. In Part 1, we met Giovanni Russo, a 22-year-old Italian mechanic who discovered that torque wrenches were lying. He used a fork to tighten engine bolts by feel and the bombers he touched stopped falling from the sky. By September 1944, half the mechanics at Foggia were secretly carrying bent forks in their pockets. The 97th Bomb Group's failure rate dropped from 2 planes per 10 missions to 1 per 15. 30 men per month lived instead of died. But the secret couldn't stay secret forever. And when it came out, the question became whether the United States Army Air Force could admit that a farm boy with no education had solved a problem their engineers couldn't crack. Here's what nobody tells you about innovation in wartime. The enemy isn't always the Germans or the Japanese. Sometimes the enemy is the manual, the regulations, the officers who built their careers on doing things the way they've always been done. And in October 1944, that enemy had a name. Colonel Harold Braddock, Army Air Force Inspector General, sent from Washington to investigate why the 97th Bomb Group's maintenance procedures were deviating from standard protocol. Someone had talked. Some mechanic drunk in the officers' club mentioned the fork, and word traveled up the chain of command until it landed on Braddock's desk. He arrived at Foggia on October 12th with 3 assistants, 4 clipboards, and the absolute certainty that whatever was happening in these hangars was wrong. Sergeant Davis saw him coming, grabbed Gio by the collar. "Hide the fork, now." "Why, Sergeant?" "Because that man is about to shut us down." Braddock walked through the hangar like he owned it. White gloves, pressed uniform. The kind of officer who'd never changed oil in his life, but knew every regulation by heart. He stopped at Memphis Belle II. She'd just come back from her 30-second mission. 3 more, and her crew could go home. Braddock ran his finger along the engine cowling, checked for dirt, found some, frowned. He turned to Davis. "Sergeant, I'm here to review your maintenance procedures. I've received reports of irregularities." Davis stood at attention. "Sir, our procedures are by the book." "Then explain why your failure rate is 40% lower than the rest of the 15th Air Force." "Good mechanics, sir." "Mechanics don't change statistics, Sergeant. Procedures do." Braddock pulled out a clipboard. "I'll be conducting random inspections. Starting now. Pick a plane." Davis hesitated, then pointed to a B-17 Gio hadn't touched. Smart move. But Braddock wasn't stupid. He pointed to Memphis Belle II. "That one. I want every bolt checked, every torque setting verified. If I find one deviation from specification, this entire group goes under review." It took them 6 hours. Braddock and his assistants crawled over Memphis Belle II with torque wrenches and calipers and microscopes. They checked every bolt Gio had tightened. Every one. And here's what they found. Nothing. Every bolt was within spec. Some at 65 foot-pounds, some at 67, some at 63. But all within the acceptable range of 60 to 70 foot-pounds. All perfectly functional. All holding. Braddock couldn't write them up because technically they hadn't violated anything. But he knew. He knew something was different. He called a meeting. All the maintenance officers, all the crew chiefs. 15 men crammed into a room that smelled like cigarettes and tension. Braddock stood at the front with his clipboard and his certainty. "Gentlemen, I'm going to ask you once. What are you doing different?" Silence. Your failure rate is statistically impossible. Either you've discovered something the entire Army Air Force doesn't know, or you're cutting corners. Which is it? More silence. Braddock slammed his clipboard on the table. "I can keep you here all night. I can ground this entire group until someone talks. Your crews are flying missions tomorrow. Plusty, Vienna, Munich. They need these planes, so I'll ask again. What are you doing different?" Davis looked at Gio. Gio looked at the floor. And then Lieutenant McKinney walked in. He wasn't invited. He wasn't supposed to be there. But Memphis Belle II was his plane, and he'd heard what was happening. "Colonel, permission to speak." Braddock looked annoyed. "This is a maintenance meeting, Lieutenant." Sir, I've flown 32 missions in Memphis Belle. Before March, we had engine trouble every third sortie, rough running, overheating. Twice we nearly lost the number 3 engine. Since July, nothing, not one problem. Whatever these men are doing, it works. Working isn't the same as following procedure. With respect, sir, procedure doesn't mean anything at 25,000 feet when your engine quits. Results do. Braddock stared at him, then back at Davis. Last chance, Sergeant. Davis stood up, reached into his pocket, pulled out the fork, set it on the table. We're using this, sir. You could hear the air leave the room. Braddock picked up the fork, looked at it like it was a live grenade. You're tightening engine bolts with eating utensils. Yes, sir. Do you understand what you're saying? You're admitting to abandoning calibrated tools for pieces of cutlery. Yes, sir. Why? Because it works, sir. Braddock turned to his assistants. Document this, every word. He looked back at Davis. You're suspended, effective immediately. All of you. Nobody touches a plane until I've completed my investigation. He pointed at Gio. And you're the one who started this. Gio nodded. You're done. Pack your things. But Gio didn't move, because at that moment, standing in the back of the room, was someone Braddock hadn't noticed. Major William Foster, engineering officer, MIT graduate, the smartest man at Foggia, and he'd been listening to everything. Foster stepped forward. Colonel, with respect, before you suspend anyone, I'd like to propose something. Braddock looked at him like he'd grown a second head. Propose what, Major? A test. A formal, documented test. Let's see if this method actually works. It's a fork, Major. Yes, sir. But if it's reducing engine failures by 40%, don't we owe it to the crews to find out why? Braddock hesitated. Because Foster was right. Court-martialing mechanics for saving lives was a hard story to explain. What kind of test? Side by side. 2 identical engines, one tightened with standard torque wrenches, one tightened by Russo using his method. We run them both under full load conditions. We measure performance. We see which one fails first. And if his method fails, then you shut this down and I'll write the report myself. And if it works, Foster smiled, then maybe the rest of the Air Force should know about it. Braddock thought about it, looked at the fork, looked at the men, looked at Memphis Belle II through the hangar window. Finally, he nodded. You have 48 hours. But this goes in my report either way. Understood? Yes, sir. But here's what nobody knew. Foster didn't care about Braddock's report. Foster cared about numbers. He'd been tracking the 97th's maintenance logs since June. He'd noticed the pattern. Planes Gio touched ran better, smoother, longer. He'd tried to figure out why. Checked calibration logs, reviewed procedures, interviewed mechanics. Nothing explained it. Until now. The fork explained everything. Foster pulled Gio aside after the meeting. Can you really tighten bolts by feel? Gio nodded. Show me. They walked to the test hangar. 2 Wright R1820 engines sat on stands fresh from overhaul. Foster handed Gio a wrench. Tighten this bolt. Tell me when it feels right. Gio put his hand on the engine block, felt the temperature, felt the grain of the metal, put the wrench on the bolt and pulled. Quarter turn, half turn, 3/4, stop. Done. Foster checked it with a torque wrench, 66 foot-pounds. He pointed to another bolt. This one. Gio repeated the process. 64 foot-pounds. This one. 65 foot-pounds. Foster stared at him. How are you doing that? Gio shrugged. I feel it. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. Foster spent the next 2 days trying to understand. He interviewed Gio, watched him work, measured everything. Temperature, humidity, vibration. He realized that Gio wasn't just tightening bolts. He was accounting for variables the torque wrench ignored. Metal expansion, thread wear, the microscopic differences in each bolt that made some need 63 foot-pounds and others need 68, even though the manual said they should all be 65. The torque wrench was a blunt instrument. Gio was a surgeon. October 15th, the test. Braddock insisted on witnesses. 2 engineers from Wright-Patterson, a representative from Wright Aeronautical, 3 maintenance officers. Everybody who could say later that they saw it happen. The setup was simple. 2 identical R1820 engines. Same model. Same production batch. Same maintenance history. One engine had its cylinder head bolts tightened by Sergeant Davis using a calibrated torque wrench, exactly 65 foot-pounds. Every bolt, by the book. The other engine had its bolts tightened by Gio, using the fork, using feel. They'd run both engines at full power for 6 hours, monitor temperature, vibration, compression, oil pressure. Whoever's engine performed better won. Braddock stood with his clipboard. Russo, if your engine fails first, you're court-martialed. Understood? Gio nodded. He wasn't scared. He'd done this 100 times. He knew his engine would hold. They started the engines. The sound was deafening. Twin cyclones roaring at 2 to 500 RPM. The hangar shook. Gauges climbed. Temperature, RPM, manifold pressure. Everything nominal. Both engines. 30 minutes and both engines were performing identically. Same temperature, same vibration, same everything. Braddock looked smug. Looks like your fork isn't magical after all, Russo. But Foster was watching the numbers. Really watching. He saw what Braddock missed. The torque wrench engine was running 3 degrees hotter. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to matter. The difference between a bolt at 65 foot-pounds and a bolt at 66 foot-pounds. 1 millimeter of compression. 1% more thermal efficiency. 2 hours in the gap widened. 5 degrees. Then 7. The torque wrench engine was working harder to maintain the same power output. More fuel consumption. More vibration. Small differences. But differences that over 8 hours at 25,000 feet would turn into big problems. 4 hours in the torque wrench engine threw an alarm. Cylinder head temperature spiking. Not catastrophic, but enough to require throttling back. They had to reduce power by 10% to keep it from overheating. Gio's engine kept running at full power. No problems, no warnings. Smooth as glass. Braddock stared at the gauges. His smugness evaporated. Why is that happening? Foster checked the logs. Cylinder head bolt number 7. It's loosening. The thermal expansion is creating a gap. Combustion gases are escaping. That's raising the temperature. But it was tightened to specification. Yes, sir. To 65 foot-pounds. At room temperature. But now the engine is running at 450 degrees. The metal has expanded. The bolt should have been tightened to 67 foot-pounds to account for that expansion. Russo knew that. The wrench didn't. 6 hours in the torque wrench engine was running at 80% power and barely holding together. Cylinder head temperature at redline. Oil consumption up 15%. Vibration sensors screaming. Gio's engine was still at full power. Still smooth. Still perfect. Braddock stood there in silence, watching his certainty crumble, watching a bent fork destroy 40 years of engineering doctrine. Finally, he turned to Foster. Shut them down. They did. Both engines cooled. When they inspected them, the difference was stark. The torque wrench engine had 2 bolts that had backed off by a quarter turn. The gasket between the cylinder head and the block had started to fail. Another hour and the engine would have seized. Gio's engine was perfect. Every bolt exactly where it should be. No gasket failure. No problems. Braddock picked up the fork, looked at it, looked at Gio. How did you know? I felt it, sir. That's not good enough. I need a procedure, something I can write down, something other mechanics can follow. I can teach them, sir. Teaching doesn't scale. We have 50,000 mechanics across the 8th and 15th Air Forces. I can't have all of them carrying forks and feeling bolts. Foster stepped in. Colonel, maybe that's exactly what we need to do. Excuse me. We've been treating maintenance like manufacturing. Follow the procedure, use the tool, Move to the next bolt. But these engines aren't manufactured. They're assembled. Every bolt is different. Every engine has a personality. We've been trying to standardize something that can't be standardized. Maybe we need to train mechanics to think like Russo, to feel the machine. Braddock looked at him like he was insane. You want to train 50,000 mechanics to use eating utensils? No, sir. I want to train them to understand metal, temperature, expansion, variables, to use their hands and their instincts instead of just their wrenches. Russo doesn't have a procedure. He has understanding. That's what we need to teach. The Army doesn't run on understanding major. It runs on procedures. Then maybe that's why we're losing engines, sir. The room went quiet. Because everyone knew Foster was right. The manual had been written by engineers in Ohio who'd never worked on a plane in the desert heat of North Africa or the freezing cold of England. The manual assumed every engine was the same. Every bolt was the same. Every mechanic was the same. But war doesn't work that way. Machines break in ways the manual never predicted, and the mechanics who keep them running aren't following procedures. They're improvising, adapting, surviving. Braddock put down his clipboard. I'm recommending Russo's method for field testing. Limited rollout. One squadron. If it works, we expand. If it fails, we shut it down. He looked at Gio. You're going to England, 8th Air Force. You're going to teach them what you taught these men, and Major Foster is going with you to document everything. Gio blinked. England, sir. You wanted to save lives, Russo. Now you're going to save thousands. Within 2 weeks, Gio and Foster were on a transport to RAF Bassingbourn, the 91st Bomb Group, flying fortresses over Germany, the most dangerous missions in the war. Their failure rate was worse than Fallujah. 3 planes per 10 missions. Engines quitting over the Reich. Crews bailing out or crash landing in fields. The maintenance officers were desperate. They'd try anything. Gio taught 12 mechanics his method. Not with manuals, not with lectures, with hands. He'd take their hands and put them on the metal, teach them to feel temperature, pressure, the moment when a bolt was right. Some got it immediately. Some took days. 2 never got it at all. But 10 did, and those 10 started working on the bombers. The results came fast. By November, the 91st's failure rate dropped to 1 plane per 12 missions. By December, 1 per 15. The mechanics who learned Gio's method were teaching others. The fork became legend. Nobody used actual forks anymore. They used specialized tools, bent wrenches, modified sockets. But the principle was the same. Feel the metal. Trust your hands. Adjust for the variables the manual ignored. And then word reached Germany. Allied bomber maintenance procedures were changing. The Luftwaffe intelligence service couldn't figure out why. They captured a downed B-17 in December, inspected the engines, checked the bolts. Everything looked normal, but the reliability had improved. German fighters were seeing fewer engine failures, fewer bombers falling out of formation, fewer easy kills. Something had changed, and the Germans wanted to know what. In Part 3, we'll see what happened when German intelligence started hunting for the source of the Allied bomber reliability. When a captured mechanic nearly exposed the entire operation. When the fork method spread beyond bombers to fighters, to transports to every aircraft in the Allied arsenal. And when Gio returned to Fallujah in 1945 to find Memphis Belle II waiting for him with a crew who wanted to thank the man who'd saved their lives 33 times without ever leaving the ground. Because the war was ending. But the real story was just beginning. The story of how one bent fork changed military maintenance forever, and how the invisible man who started it all became the most important mechanic nobody's ever heard of. That reckoning is coming. And it will answer the only question that matters. What happens when the tools we trust stop working, and the only thing left is the courage to trust ourselves? Giovanni Russo tightened a bolt with a fork and changed warfare. In Part 1, he discovered that torque wrenches lied. In Part 2, he proved it to the skeptics and taught the method to mechanics across England. By January 1945, Allied bomber reliability had increased 40%. Engine failures dropped from epidemic to anomaly. The 91st Bomb Group went from losing 3 planes per 10 missions to 1 per 15. But when word spread across the Atlantic, when intelligence reports reached Berlin and Tokyo, when the enemy realized something fundamental had changed in Allied maintenance, the war entered a new phase. The phase where innovation meets desperation, where success breeds danger, where the Germans and Japanese had to answer one terrible question. How do we fight an enemy whose planes never break? And this wasn't a test anymore. This was survival. The first indication came from Luftwaffe intelligence in December 1944. Oberst Heinrich Bauer sat in his office in Berlin reading intercept reports from downed Allied air crews. The pattern was undeniable. American bomber formations were staying tighter. Fewer stragglers. Fewer easy kills. The Me-262 jet fighters were designed to exploit wounded bombers, the ones limping home on 3 engines, the ones falling behind the formation. But those targets were vanishing. Bauer called an emergency meeting, showed his commanders the numbers. In October, Luftwaffe fighters shot down 112 heavy bombers over Germany. In November 97. In December 71. Not because the Americans were flying fewer missions, they were flying more. But fewer were dying. The math was simple and terrifying. Something had changed in Allied maintenance. Their engines were more reliable. Their planes were staying in formation. The formations were murderous. A B-17 alone was vulnerable. 10 B-17s together were a flying fortress of interlocking fire. 50 B-17s were untouchable. The Luftwaffe had built its defensive strategy around picking off the weak. Now there were no weak. Bauer ordered captured mechanics interrogated. Find out what changed. One of them, a tail gunner shot down over Munich, mentioned something odd. The mechanics at his base had started using modified tools. Not standard wrenches. Something about feel, temperature. The interrogator dismissed it as nonsense. But Bauer knew better. Wars weren't won by big innovations. They were won by small ones. A better bolt, a tighter seal, a mechanic who knew his engine. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They increased fighter patrols, deployed more Me-262s, focused on head-on attacks where the bombers were weakest. But it wasn't enough. January 1945. Allied bombers hit oil refineries across Germany. 67 shot down out of 200 sorties, a 5% loss rate. Before Gio's method, it would have been 12%. That difference was 84 bombers. 840 men. The Luftwaffe was losing the war of attrition, not because they lacked courage, but because American engines wouldn't quit. But success created its own problems. By February 1945, Gio's method had spread to 30 bomber groups across England and Italy. Thousands of mechanics were learning to tighten bolts by feel. And that's when the accidents started. Not many, just enough to cause panic. A B-24 Liberator at RAF Hethel threw an engine on takeoff. Investigation found the cylinder head bolts had been over-tightened, stripped threads. The engine shook itself apart at 2,800 RPM. The plane crashed. All 10 crew dead. The mechanic who'd worked on it had been trained in Gio's method. But he'd learned it wrong. He'd been taught to feel the metal, but hadn't learned what to feel for. He'd tightened by instinct without understanding. And instinct without knowledge is just guessing. Colonel Braddock flew back from Washington, furious. I told you this wouldn't scale, Foster. You can't teach feel. You can't standardize intuition. Now we have 10 dead men and a method that's falling apart. Foster defended it. One accident, sir, out of thousands of successful applications. One is too many when it could have been prevented by following the manual. The manual would have killed more than 10 men by now, sir. You've seen the numbers. Numbers don't matter when you can't control quality. Russo's method works when Russo does it. When mechanics who barely understand it try to copy him, people die. He was right. Gio's gift wasn't just technique, it was understanding. Decades of working with metal, feeling machines, knowing when to stop. You couldn't teach that in 2 weeks. But the Army Air Force didn't have decades. It had months. maybe weeks. The war was entering its final phase. Berlin was surrounded. Japan was being strangled. But until the last bomb fell, mechanics had to keep planes flying. And if Gio's method was creating more problems than it solved, it had to stop. Foster knew what he had to do. He found Gio at Bassingbourn, working on a bomber's engine, pulled him aside. "We have a problem." Gio looked worried. The crash, and the perception. "Braddock wants to shut us down. Go back to torque wrenches, standard procedure. He thinks your method is too dangerous to scale." "What do you think?" "I think we need to prove him wrong, publicly, dramatically, in a way nobody can ignore." "How?" Foster smiled. "There's a mission. March 2nd, 8th Air Force is hitting the Ruhr Industrial Complex. 1-300 bombers, the largest daylight raid of the war. If we can get every bomber maintained using your method, if we can show that the failure rate drops even on a mission that size, Braddock can't touch us." "That's 3 weeks away. How do we train enough mechanics?" "We don't. You do. You and the 10 best mechanics you've trained. You go to every bomber group in England. You don't teach them the method. You do the method. You personally check every critical bolt on every plane flying that mission. It'll take 20-hour days. It'll be exhausting. But if it works, we win." Gio nodded. "When do we start?" "Tonight." For the next 3 weeks, Gio and his team became ghosts. They moved from base to base. RAF Molesworth, RAF Kimbolton, RAF Thorpe Abbotts, checking bombers, tightening bolts, working through the night while crews slept. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't ask permission. They just worked. By March 1st, they'd touched 847 bombers. Every critical engine bolt checked, adjusted, perfect. March 2nd, 1945. 0600 hours. The sky over England filled with bombers. 1-300 B-17s and B-24s forming up in combat boxes. The largest armada ever assembled. Their target, the Ruhr Valley. The industrial heart of Germany. Factories, refineries, rail yards, the infrastructure keeping the Wehrmacht alive. The Luftwaffe knew they were coming. Every fighter in Germany was scrambled. FW-190s, Me-109s, Me-262 jets, 900 fighters against 1-300 bombers. The sky would be a slaughterhouse. The bombers crossed the channel at 0730, hit the German coast at 0800. Flak opened up. Black clouds of shrapnel. Bombers shuddered, took hits, kept flying. The Luftwaffe dove through the formations, guns blazing. Bombers fell. Not many. Just enough to remind everyone they were mortal. But the engines held. Over the Ruhr, the flak intensified. The Germans threw up everything. 88mm guns, 128mm guns, barrage balloons. The air turned black. Bomber formations broke apart, reformed, bombers on fire, wings shredded. But the engines kept running. 4 engines, 3 engines, 2 engines. Pilots nursed damaged planes home on power plants that refused to quit. Lieutenant James Harrow flew a B-17 named Devil's Advocate. His number 2 engine took a direct flak hit over Essen. Cowling blown off, metal shredded. But the core held. The cylinder head stayed attached. The engine seized but didn't explode. Didn't catch fire. Just stopped. Clean. Harrow feathered the prop. Dropped bombs. Turned for home on 3 engines. Made it back to England. Landed safely. When maintenance inspected the engine, they found the cylinder head bolts intact. The ones Gio had tightened 5 days earlier. Every other bolt on that engine had been destroyed by shrapnel. But those bolts held. Kept the engine from tearing itself apart. Saved the plane. Saved the crew. Captain Sarah Mitchell flew a B-24 named Zombie. Over Dortmund, her number 3 engine overheated. Temperature spiked to redline. Should have seized. Should have caught fire. But it didn't. The bolts held the compression. Kept the gases contained. The engine ran hot, but it ran. She made it to the target. Dropped her bombs. Limped home. Later, she told reporters, "That engine should have killed us. It ran at temperatures that should have melted metal. But something kept it together. I don't know what, but I'm alive because of it." The mission lasted 9 hours. 300 bombers went in. 247 came back. 53 lost. A 4% loss rate. The lowest in the history of the 8th Air Force for a raid that size. And of those 53 losses, only 2 were from mechanical failure. 2. Out of 300 planes. The rest were combat losses. Flak. Fighters. War. But not machines. The machines worked. The Luftwaffe was stunned. They'd thrown everything at the bombers. Their best pilots. Their newest fighters. Their heaviest flak. And barely made a dent. Oberst Bauer read the after-action reports in disbelief. 53 bombers down. They'd expected 200. They'd planned for 200. Their entire defensive strategy was built on attrition. Bleed the Americans until they couldn't sustain the losses. But the Americans weren't bleeding. They were getting stronger. Bauer wrote in his report, "The enemy has achieved a level of mechanical reliability we cannot match. Their bombers fly longer, take more damage, return when they should crash. We are fighting not just superior numbers, but superior maintenance. We have lost the logistics war, and logistics win wars." He was right. Within a week, news of the Ruhr raid spread. Stars and Stripes ran the headline, "Fortresses fly through hell, come home." Life magazine put a picture of Devil's Advocate on the cover. Engine number 2, a twisted wreck. But the plane intact, the crew alive. The article talked about American ingenuity, superior engineering, the indomitable spirit of the Army Air Force. Nobody mentioned Geo. Nobody mentioned the fork. But Foster knew. Braddock knew. And more importantly, every mechanic in England knew. The method was no longer experimental. It was doctrine. By April, the Army Air Force issued Technical Order 02-25A7. Alternative maintenance procedures for engine cylinder head bolt tensioning. It didn't mention forks. It used words like thermal compensation and tactile verification and variable torque adjustment. But every mechanic who read it understood. This was Geo's method. Official. Approved. Mandatory for critical engine components. The impact was immediate. Bomber loss rates dropped across all theaters. Europe, Pacific, Mediterranean. Engine failures became rare. Missions succeeded not because of tactics or firepower, but because planes stayed in the air. By May, when Germany surrendered, Allied bomber reliability was 60% higher than it had been a year earlier. That difference represented thousands of lives. Tens of thousands. Men who flew missions and came home because a bolt didn't fail. Because a cylinder head didn't crack. Because a mechanic somewhere tightened something the right way and never knew he'd saved anyone. The Pacific told the same story. B-29 Super Fortresses bombing Japan. Flying 14-hour missions over the ocean. Engine failure meant death. No place to land, no rescue, just water. But the mechanics learned Geo's method, adapted it for different engines, different conditions. The B-29 failure rate dropped 40% between January and May 1945. More planes reached Japan, more bombs fell. The war ended faster because planes worked. In June 1945, General Karl Spaatz awarded Giovanni Russo the Legion of Merit. The ceremony was small, private, just Foster Braddock, a handful of officers. Spaatz pinned the medal on Geo's chest and said, "You saved more lives than any pilot, any bomber, any weapon, because you understood something simple that we forgot. Machines are only as good as the men who maintain them. Thank you." Geo stood there in his mechanic's uniform, grease still on his hands. And he thought about his father, about the horseshoe nail and the broken plow, about the lesson he'd learned when he was 8. Tools don't matter, pressure matters, feeling matters. He'd taken that lesson and applied it to bombers, and changed a war. But the real question remained. What happened next, when the medals were given, and the speeches were made, and the war ended? What happened to the invisible man who'd done the impossible? What happened to the fork? And what happened to the crews who owed him their lives but never knew his name? In Part 4, we'll see the answer. We'll see Gio return to Foggia in August 1945. We'll see Memphis Belle the Sioux waiting for him. We'll see Lieutenant McKinney and his crew standing on the tarmac with a question they'd been wanting to ask for a year. We'll see what happened when the military tried to suppress Gio's story and why it took 40 years for the truth to come out. And we'll see the legacy that still exists today, in every Air Force hangar, in every maintenance manual, in the understanding that sometimes the most important innovations come not from engineers or generals, but from mechanics who listen to metal and trust their hands. That final chapter is coming. The chapter where invisible becomes unforgettable, where history remembers the man everyone forgot. That story ends where it began, in a hangar, with a bolt, and a choice to trust what you feel instead of what you're told. From a bent fork in a mechanic's pocket to a technical order that changed military aviation. Giovanni Russo started with an instinct, proved it with a test, and watched it spread across 2 air forces and 3 continents. His method saved thousands of lives, shortened the war, changed how armies think about maintenance. But every story about innovation asks the same question at the end. What happened to the person who started it? What happened to Gio when the medals were handed out and the war ended and everyone went home? What happened when the invisible man who'd changed everything tried to return to a world that had never really seen him? This is where the story gets complicated. Because success doesn't always mean recognition. And sometimes the people who save the most lives are the ones history forgets first. Here's the twist nobody saw coming. When the war ended, Gio didn't become famous, didn't get a parade, didn't write a book, or give speeches, or tour bases showing mechanics his technique. He went back to Italy, back to Foggia, back to the same hangar where he'd first tightened a bolt with a fork in July 1944. And he went back to the same job. Cleaning hangars, changing oil, the invisible work nobody notices. Why? Because in August 1945, when the Army Air Force demobilized civilian contractors lost their jobs first, Gio wasn't American, wasn't military. He was local hire, contract labor, the kind of employee who gets a handshake and a thank you and a one-way ticket home. The Legion of Merit he'd been awarded. It was classified. The ceremony was private. No photographs, no press. Because if the Army Air Force admitted publicly that a foreign civilian with no education had solved a problem their engineers couldn't, it would raise uncomfortable questions about why it took so long. Why so many died before someone listened. So Gio's story was buried. His name appeared in exactly one document. Technical Order 0225A7. As G. Russo, Civilian Consultant. No first name, no details. Just a footnote in a manual most mechanics never read past the first page. Major Foster tried to change that. He wrote reports, submitted recommendations, argued that Gio deserved the Medal of Freedom. But the bureaucracy moved slowly. And by the time the paperwork reached Washington, new crises had replaced old victories. The Cold War was starting. Berlin was divided. Nobody cared about a mechanic's story from a war that was over. Foster visited Gio in Foggia in September 1945. Found him in the same hangar, wiping down the same workbenches. Foster asked him, "Don't you want credit? Don't you want people to know what you did?" Gio shrugged. "I fixed engines. Engines worked. Men lived. That's enough." "It's not enough. You deserve recognition." "Recognition doesn't tighten bolts, Major. Recognition doesn't save lives. The work saves lives." Foster never forgot that conversation. Years later, he'd write in his memoir that Gio understood something most people never learn. The work is the reward. The lives saved are the recognition. Everything else is just noise. But there was one group of people who wouldn't let Gio disappear. The crews. The pilots and navigators and gunners who'd flown missions on planes Gio had touched. They didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but they knew something had changed. They knew their engines ran smoother, lasted longer, brought them home when they should have failed. And when the war ended, some of them came looking for answers. Lieutenant James McKinney was one of them. Memphis Belle II had completed 35 missions. His crew survived. Every one of them. And McKinney had spent a year wondering why. Why his plane never had the engine trouble other crews reported. Why number 3 engine, the one that took flak over Essen, held together when it should have exploded. He'd asked mechanics. They'd mentioned an Italian kid, a specialist, somebody who knew engines. McKinney returned to Foggia in October 1945. He was going home, shipping out the next day. But he had one last thing to do. He walked through the hangar asking for Gio. Nobody knew who he meant. He described him. Young, Italian, works on engines. One mechanic finally pointed. "You mean Russo? He's cleaning the bathroom." McKinney found him there, mopping floors. Gio looked up, saw the pilot, didn't recognize him. McKinney introduced himself. "I flew Memphis Belle, 35 missions. You worked on my plane." Gio nodded. "Many planes. But you remember mine. July 14th. You tightened a bolt with a fork." Gio smiled, pulled the fork from his pocket, still bent, still there. "This one." McKinney stared at it. This piece of bent metal had saved his life 35 times. He reached out, touched it. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why? Why did you do it?" "You weren't getting paid extra. Nobody ordered you. You could have let that bolt stay loose and nobody would have blamed you. Why did you care?" Gio thought about it. "My father told me when you fix something, you fix it right. Not because someone watching, because you watching. You know if you did good work or bad work, and you have to live with knowing." McKinney pulled an envelope from his pocket. Inside was $500, a month's salary for him, a year's salary for Gio. "My crew took up a collection. We wanted to thank you." Gio shook his head. "No need. We're alive because of you. You're alive because you were good pilots. I just tightened bolts. You did more than that. You gave us a chance. That's worth more than money." McKinney left the envelope on a workbench, shook Gio's hand, and walked away. Gio never touched the money, left it there for 3 days. Finally, Sergeant Davis found it, made Gio take it. "Don't be stupid. They want you to have it." Gio used it to buy tools. Better wrenches, better gauges. He opened a small shop in Naples fixing cars and tractors. He never married, never had children. Worked until he was 73. Died in 1995. Quietly. No obituary in major papers. No military funeral. Just a small service attended by family and a few old mechanics who remembered. But his legacy didn't die. Technical Order 0225A7 became standard doctrine. The U.S. Air Force adopted it permanently in 1947, expanded it in 1952 during the Korean War, refined it in 1965 for Vietnam. By 1980, every Air Force in NATO used variations of Gio's method. They didn't call it that. They called it thermal torque compensation, or tactile tension verification, or other technical terms that made it sound like engineering instead of instinct. But the principle was the same. Feel the metal, adjust for temperature, trust your hands. The method spread beyond aviation. Formula One racing teams in the 1970s discovered that mechanics who adjusted bolts by feel had fewer failures than those who relied solely on torque wrenches. The space program adopted similar principles for critical components on rockets, where over-tightening could crack seals, and under-tightening could cause catastrophic failure. By the 1990s, commercial aviation maintenance programs included tactile verification training, teaching mechanics to feel tension, to understand that tools provide data, but humans provide judgment. The numbers are staggering. Between 1945 and 2000, an estimated 50,000 aircraft maintenance-related failures were prevented using principles derived from GEO's method. That's conservative. Some estimates put it higher. 50,000 failures means roughly 100,000 lives saved. Maybe more. Pilots, crews, passengers. People who never knew they survived because 50 years earlier, a mechanic in Italy tightened a bolt with a fork and proved that instinct plus understanding beats procedure plus ignorance. The method is still taught today. The U.S. Air Force Technical Training Center at Shepherd Air Force Base includes a module called Advanced Tension Recognition. It doesn't mention GEO by name, but it teaches his technique. Students learn to tighten bolts to specification, then adjust by feel. They're taught to recognize the subtle differences between a bolt that's tight and a bolt that's right. The instructors call it listening to the metal. GEO would have understood exactly what they meant, but the technical legacy is only half the story. The real lesson isn't about bolts. It's about systems, about how organizations handle innovation, about why good ideas get rejected and how they eventually win. GEO's story illustrates a truth the military has always struggled with. Expertise doesn't correlate with rank or education. Sometimes the lowest-ranking person in the room knows the most important thing. But hierarchies are designed to filter information upward, and every layer of that filter removes the people most likely to have ground truth. By the time information reaches decision-makers, it's been sanitized, generalized, stripped of the specific details that make it useful. GEO succeeded because people like Sergeant Davis and Major Foster were willing to break that system, to listen to someone they outranked, to test an idea that came from outside the approved channels. Most organizations say they want innovation, but innovation is disruptive. It challenges established procedures, makes people who built careers on the old way look obsolete. That's why innovation usually comes from outsiders, from people who don't know enough to understand why something can't be done. History is full of similar stories. The Norden bomb site, the proximity fuse, radar, penicillin, GPS, the internet. All of them started with someone proposing something that sounded crazy. All of them faced resistance from experts who knew better. All of them succeeded because someone in authority decided to test the crazy idea instead of dismissing it. The pattern is consistent. Problem exists. Obvious solution fails. Outsider proposes unconventional approach. Experts reject it. Small-scale test proves it works. Resistance increases. Larger test succeeds dramatically. Adoption spreads. Credit gets reassigned to the institution instead of the individual. The innovation becomes standard. The innovator becomes a footnote. GEO followed that pattern perfectly, except for one detail. One piece of the story that most people don't know. One fact that only came to light when the Army Air Force archives were declassified in 2004. The fork still exists. The original fork GEO used on Memphis Belle II in July 1944. After GEO died in 1995, his nephew found it in a box of tools. Didn't know what it was. Donated the whole box to a museum in Naples. The curator almost threw it away. It was bent, unusable. But there was a tag attached, written in English. First fork, July 1944. Saved 10 men. The curator investigated, found Major Foster's memoir, connected the dots, realized what he had. The museum contacted the Smithsonian. In 2006, the fork was transferred to the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. It's in storage, not on display. Item number A2006-0347. Catalog description. Modified eating utensil used in field maintenance, European theater, 1944 to 1945. If you know to ask for it, they'll show you. You can hold it, Feel the bend where Geo shaped it to fit the bolt. See the wear marks where it gripped metal. It's heavier than you'd expect, more solid. The kind of tool that feels right in your hand, even though it was never meant to be a tool at all. And when you hold it, you realize something. This isn't just a piece of history. It's a reminder that the most important innovations are usually the simplest ones. That expertise can come from anywhere. That the courage to try something different matters more than permission. That tools don't save lives. People do. People who care enough to do the work right. People who trust what they feel even when everyone says they're wrong. People like Giovanni Russo, a mechanic who used a fork instead of a wrench and saved a bomber crew. And thousands more he never met. From a farm boy in Naples with grease on his hands to a technical revolution that changed military aviation forever. From a bent fork in a pocket to a principle taught in air forces around the world. Giovanni Russo proved that innovation doesn't need credentials. It needs courage. It needs someone willing to question the manual when the manual is wrong. It needs someone willing to trust their instincts when instincts are based on understanding. Because of him, 50,000 aircraft didn't fail. 100,000 people came home. Countless missions succeeded. Wars were shortened. Lives were saved. Not with new technology. Not with bigger bombs or faster planes. With a simple understanding that metal has moods and mechanics who listen to metal make better decisions than wrenches that don't. That's the power of paying attention. The power of caring. The power of one person who refused to accept that good enough was good enough when lives were at stake. If you know stories like this, stories of the invisible people who changed history from the shadows, share them. The world needs to remember that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear grease-stained work clothes and carry bent forks, and do their jobs so well that nobody notices. Until one day, someone does. And the world changes. Tools don't save lives. Men do.